Welcome on in to Empower Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about careers with people across the insurance industry.
5 promotions in 7 years. Today's guest has been working in insurance for less than 10 years, and I first met her when she was applying for her graduate scheme. Joanna Hitchcock has huge determination, work ethic, and is very familiar with going outside of her comfort zone. She is now the Underwriting Manager at AIG. Prior to that, she had several promotions at Liberty Specialty Markets, including moving across for an international role in Paris. Joanna is refreshingly transparent and open about her strengths and her weaknesses and how she's been able to focus her energy to achieve so much in such a quick time. She's such an inspiration. You can't help leaving a conversation with Joanna anything other than energized. And I hope you take that away from this conversation too. So welcome on in to Empower Talks.
Hi, Sam.
I haven't seen you on Zoom before.
I don't think we've ever been on a Zoom. I don't think Zoom was around when I first met you.
Feels weird. Well, we always start these podcasts with an introduction as to how you got into insurance, which I'm really looking forward to you telling people about, because I don't think I've ever heard you talk about this. So how did you end up in insurance, Joanna?
Well, funnily enough, it was with the person sitting opposite the screen. I was telling someone the other day, how long have I been in the industry? And it's coming up to 9 years, which has absolutely flown by. I can't believe it. But I guess when I look about what's happened in the 9 years, a lot has happened. And we met back in 2014, I guess, when you were running, was it talent and development in general or the grad scheme? I can't remember. Was it the whole thing?
Yeah, the two just, all came in together.
And I guess we'd had sort of the usual grad scheme applications. It got quite boring for me. I mean, I'm a red, as you know, and all these applications, online assessments, phone conversations. But finally, I think we met at the assessment centre, the first one. I guess it was Plantation Place South, wasn't it, at the time? And then I guess I got through the sort of that round and then on to the final presentation. And then you offered me a job.
Yes. And your presentation, I can remember it was really impressive. You didn't use PowerPoint. You decided to opt for another presentation tool. Do you remember that?
No. What? Yeah. As in a software tool?
Yeah.
God, that's probably trying to impress.
It was like, I didn't know there was something other than PowerPoint. It wasn't a thing that actually stuck around, but it was a little bit more animated.
Yeah, no, well, I remember I got the train down from Durham the night before. I was so nervous. It's up there with one of the most nerve-wracking things, I think. Well, not now, but at the time that I had done. And I remember I got home that night and my mum and dad said, have you prepared? And I remember I went into the living room. They said, well, do the presentation, practice it now. And you know what it's like, since that time I've done lots of sort of public speaking bits and bobs in the industry, and it gets easier each time. But obviously, when you're 20 years old, it's pretty intense. And I remember I stood there in front of them in the living room and I just burst out crying because I completely flunked everything, twisted my words. And I just saw my mum sort of jumped up and was like, oh, go on, I'm going to go make Joanna a chamomile. And then I just saw this look in my dad's eyes being absolute fear, thinking, God, she's going to get this quite wrong.
Were you as nervous once you got in the room?
No, but I remember Isabel Thomas, who was on the sort of year above grad scheme, she was sort of sitting with the grads before they sort of went in one by one to get slaughtered. And I sort of said to her, I'm so nervous. But I know once I got into it, I was okay. But no, that was good. And I remember actually you phoned me, obviously, to offer me the job. And I was outside the library, Durham Library. And I remember you said, hi, Samantha Ridgewell here from Liberty. And then my phone just cut out.
And what, you rang me back?
Well, I ran into the library. I said, does someone have a charger? I don't know whether I've got the job, or she's going to say I've not got the job, or I didn't know what you were going to say.
Oh, brilliant. But you got the job, right?
Yeah, I got the job.
How did you decide you wanted to do insurance? Like, how did you end up on the
Well, I mean, I did a degree in biochemistry. So often when people say, well, how have you ended up here? But it's sort of the same story, isn't it? When you hear about people's journeys into the industry. I mean, my father had started, I think he started at a company called Alexander Forbes. And then he set up his own broking firm, which got bought out by Lockton. So it was a sort of clear, what should Joanna do? Should she go into banking, or the typical kind of, I guess, is it banking? She's not going to be a lawyer because she's a mathematician. She's not very good at writing. Or is it property? And I guess naturally you go into an industry where you have connections. I think I'd done a handful of bits of work experience, and then in my final year, I started to apply to a few grad schemes, which was a lot harder than I thought.
You did have an impressive CV. I can still remember that.
Oh, thank you.
Although I do remember, I am gonna out you on this. There was a typo on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I remember being really...
Don't say that live on a podcast. You should make me look impeccable.
No, but I remember because it was such a perfect CV, like your greater experience, everything's so impressive. And I think you put down like work experience and you'd missed a digit off. So let's say it was 2013, you'd put like 2013 to 2003 or something like that. And I was like, oh, that's a obvious typo there.
That is really not impressive.
I think it says a lot that I remember that, right? Because it was so, you could see it was quite out of character of the CV.
Yeah, God, slow down. Is the motto.
Okay, so then you started. What was your route into?
Obviously, I remember actually. So I started, I think at the time, there were 2 underwriting graduates, weren't there? One in claims, one in exposure management, maybe in a couple of school leavers. So I was one of the underwriting graduates. I think I did 6 months basically in the marine division, which was really interesting actually, because obviously by nature of the, most marine divisions in the industry, it's not just property or it's not just energy, you're going around, a few very, very different classes of business. So that was really interesting to sort of get an overview of different classes of business. And I guess then that was the first 6 months. And then do you remember that you had put me into a special role?
You did like a strategy role, right?
Yeah, in the strategy role, which was obviously really interesting, working with Tim Knight. So, and then I think I didn't do the full 6 months there because I think it was that typical, what are we going to do at the end of the year? And I obviously did want to go into underwriting. So then I moved back into the marine division. And I think at the time, the terrorism team, it was growing, obviously profitable class of business. I think that they had plans to expand. So I tried to sort of go into an area where I knew there would be opportunity. That's the thing. I guess it was completely by chance that I ended up in terrorism. But I sort of, being the person I am, I thought, how am I going to become an underwriter? What class of business is growing? Where is the opportunity? I was very set on going into reinsurance at one point in time. But at the time, I guess there wasn't necessarily the opportunity to take on young people. So I guess I just took the opportunity where I saw there was a sort of gap.
Yeah. It's kind of a question of like, do you go into a team where you can see kind of immediate development and progression, or faster, I should say, rather than immediate, or one where you're going to have to potentially wait for that opportunity to come up? It's fair to say you're not very good at waiting.
No, and that's either a very good thing and it has meant fast progression, but it's also meant if I'm sort of feeling like I'm not going quickly, then I get frustrated, which is definitely something I've got better at dealing with, because you can't always expect everything to be immediate, So I guess it's one of my biggest strengths, but also probably one of my biggest weaknesses, that kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm. And you flew through your CII, didn't you? I remember you did an exam before you started. People ask me about this quite a lot, actually. They say, is it worth me doing an exam ahead of my first job? And I always say, just don't worry, it's fine. They're going to look after you once you start. But I can remember you did do LM1, didn't you? Like over your summer holidays before you started.
I did LM1. I guess I was just, really excited, wanted to get going. Again, typical of me, wanting to probably run before I can walk. But I kind of I knew the importance of the exams. I knew that they, they're not necessarily difficult, but, they're long, aren't they? I mean, how many modules are there in total?
12 usually, depending on your route.
Yeah. So I was keen to get going. I think I completed it within 18 months, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So no, that was a really good achievement, actually. I'm glad I got it out the way. And I remember speaking to a few people at Liberty at the time, and they said, God, you get going on it, because otherwise you'll never do it, type thing. And I can't stress that enough. And when I'm talking now, I'm obviously working at Talbot AIG. When I'm speaking to the younger junior underwriters, I sort of really pass on that advice. Come on, guys, get going, because if the longer you leave it, the slower you will be, and it will just hang over you for years. So no, it is really important.
Yeah. If we looked at your CV today compared to that version of 8 years ago, I think one of the most exciting things for me looking at what you've been able to do is all the international relocations that you've had, those kind of opportunities. I think the first one for you was Dubai, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So people again always ask, like, how do I get those opportunities? So how did that come about? Like, what do you think made that happen?
Yeah, it's weird because a friend actually asked me this the other day, and I said, you know what, actually, I think people probably look from the outside and think, oh, Joanna's very lucky. She's worked in Dubai, went to Paris, but things don't actually just fall onto your lap. You really have to, and that's sort of one word of advice I'd give anyone younger coming up into the industry and wanting progression, is that you absolutely have to put yourself out there for these opportunities. They don't just fall onto your lap. You really have to create your own luck. And I was very lucky actually to be working in such a dynamic, division, and Liberty actually was an amazing company to start your career at, because it's a big company, big American company, not a traditional American company. I think the mutual aspect really plays into that. And I think that they really empowered young people to take opportunity, and nothing was too great, basically. So I was lucky that one of the assistant underwriters in Dubai was going on maternity leave. So they needed a bit of cover. Obviously in London, there's naturally more people. So they said, Joanna, would you like to go and cover this lady's maternity leave? So I obviously jumped at that opportunity. 23 years old, going to Dubai for 4 months, just completed my ACII. So off I went. And that was a really amazing experience.
What was the best parts of that experience?
The bottomless brunches.
Yeah.
No, you know what? It was obviously I'd never worked abroad. I'd done a lot of traveling actually at university, but I'd never obviously worked abroad. And I think, and this obviously went into another whole level when I moved to Paris. But I think going and working in a different environment, culture is fascinating, eye-opening, in fact. And I think naturally when you leave London and you go out into sort of more of those smaller offices, overseas offices, I do think you're more exposed, I guess, to the business, that most from an underwriting perspective. Usually it's a smaller book of business. It's less transactional. I mean, terrorism is a very transactional class of business, but obviously sitting in Lloyd's, everything's happening at 100 miles an hour. Going out into a sort of slower paced environment was actually really good for my development, because it meant that I could actually take more in. Things were going a bit more slowly, which is sometimes what you need when you're young and everything's quite new.
So with the sort of the culture there being, I think your things just more relaxed in terms of timescales. The other thing I kind of observe in Dubai that I think is really unique is pretty much everybody that's there has moved there for their work. People are really focused on their careers, and that's kind of a part of their life, and also often a point in time for them rather than necessarily sort of putting down roots there. So I think it's quite a unique place, because people are kind of like, I'm here and I'm going to make the most of my time here from a career perspective, but also from a experience perspective and travel and all of those types of things. And I think that just, I don't know, it just kind of gives it this completely different edge to everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It was an amazing 4 months, really, really amazing experience. And I actually think that doing that was almost like the pathway to then going to obviously move to Paris for 3.5 years, because I think once you've lived abroad and worked abroad, you think, God, that was absolutely fascinating. I've really opened up a whole different, my experience now. And it's not just experience in order to progress in your career and get the next job, but it's personal experiences, the way that you view things. I think you have then more understanding of people from different cultures. Anyone that has any opportunity to work abroad, I would really, really recommend it. I'm not saying I want to jet off tomorrow, but if the right opportunity came up again, I would be off in a heartbeat.
So you came back to London after that one?
Yeah, came back to London, and then I stayed in London for about 3 years. went back into Lloyd's, just progressing learning really as an assistant underwriter. Then 3 years passed, and obviously not just terrorism, but there was a massive initiative for some of the specialist lines to, move out and develop on the continent. And I remember at the time, actually, they'd gone externally to hire this underwriter because, on surface value, I was basically a graduate when I went, I'd just come off the graduate scheme when I went to Dubai. So, I'd only had about 4 years in the market. And naturally, you're not going to send a 25-year-old assistant underwriter with limited underwriting authority out to France or Germany or wherever it could have been based to go and develop a book of business from scratch. I mean, you'd be crazy. So they obviously looked externally to begin with. And I don't think they had much luck with that. I think they got quite far down the line with someone and then didn't work out. And then I remember I thought, God, I really, really would love to do this. I don't think I have the ability to do it, but I really want to do this. I really want to move. I'd love to take this opportunity. So I pulled my manager downstairs for a coffee and I said, would you consider me for this job? And at the time, Paul Beattie, he looked across the table at me and I think he thought, God, he said to me, well, we were sort of waiting for you to put your hand up. Knowing you.
Because you they'd be crazy. And they're like, why should not us?
Yeah, exactly. We were waiting for the crazy, overambitious graduate to ask to be sent abroad again. And they gave me the opportunity. And I don't work with them anymore, but I can't thank Paul and Mike Burl for giving me that opportunity. I was very young. I was very inexperienced. I had no modern language skills. So I think when I actually arrived on the other side, everyone thought, well, what's she doing here?
I remember that relocation process actually, because I can remember you kind of being like, cool, got the job and so on. And then this kind of look of panic in your eyes where you're like, I've got to relocate. I don't speak the language. I've got no idea where I'm going to live. And it was kind of about 3 weeks of rush to be like, hey, how do I sort my life out to do this?
Exactly. And I think my father dropped me off at the Eurostar and he said to me a few years in, obviously when it started to go well, he said, I was quite concerned, but I dropped you off that day thinking, I don't know how, because he'd been in the industry and he sort of knew that it was quite a big ask. And he said, well, yeah, I did sort of think when I dropped you off that, yeah, I wished you well. But I think even my dad looked quite panicked at the thought of it all.
So how did you do it? Breaking it down one step at a time. What about that kind of relocation process worked, and maybe what would you do different with hindsight?
So I guess, I arrived and I remember I got given a book, my first 100 days in your new job. And I broke down a strategy with how I would do it. And I guess it was based in Paris, but it was basically growth of the terrorism product across our European hub offices. So in 6 countries, basically. So I break it down into each country and, developed a quite comprehensive strategy. Now that's all well and good having that academic view, but actually when you get out there, you think, okay, well, you're going to have to rip that up because none of that actually makes sense now. So from a work perspective, I mean, it was a huge challenge and I would be, going out and, meeting the brokers and stuff. But at the time, I wasn't fully developed as an underwriter. So I would be almost working more than 12 hours in a day because I would be sort of meeting people in the day and I'd have to be quickly having to underwrite, get the sign off from colleagues in London. And it worked well though. They obviously came back to me very quickly. Yes, Joanna, change this, change that. And, in 6 months, I'd say, of doing that, I was really up and running to be able to do everything. But I guess that kind of intensity, because I was quite inexperienced and junior at the time, I had to work very, very hard. I had to work at night to do all of the underwriting and in the day be pretending that I was an underwriter, fully comprehensive underwriter. So that was a real challenge. And, I had to really get my head down. I think from a personal perspective, the language was a real challenge for me because you go in and, you know me very well. I'm obviously very chatty, open. I like connecting with people and, to have that taken away from you, I felt completely dislocated because, not everyone speaks English. They really don't. And they shouldn't have to, it's not England. And to go into an environment where you're dislocated, I remember having to go around sort of cocktail parties with brokers and I didn't even know where to look. I didn't know whether to look at the floor or look at people, or I just didn't understand what anyone was saying. And I used to have to go to the loos and then have a 10-minute break and then go back out. So it wasn't the culture shock. I think the language was really, really challenging for me. But, that got better in time.
How long would you say that took, for you to feel able to communicate?
So we moved offices. When I arrived, I got given this desk by a wall, basically by myself or with two other underwriters. And then everyone else in the office was together. And then I was, on a silo. So that didn't really help. We moved offices I think it was about a year into the job. I remember actually Richard De Getz at the time, he said, I need Joanna in the center of the office because she needs to integrate. And that was obviously really, really beneficial because then I was in the heart of the hustle and bustle. So I think when you move abroad, it takes at least 18 months to settle in. Maybe not in Dubai, 4 months there, I was in the heart of it because you don't, it's more international. Obviously going out into Europe, there's not so many expats. I think it took a good 18 months, basically.
Have you watched Emily in Paris?
Yeah.
I've got flashbacks of Emily in Paris listening to you like, this girl comes here, she doesn't speak any French.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because it's just not going to work. I remember they probably didn't think that. They thought, why have London sent out this young girl that doesn't speak languages and has only got 4 years of experience?
So how did you manage that? Because there's the technical role, but fitting into a team, again, like just looking at on paper, you've got somebody with not much experience who doesn't speak the language or like, hasn't worked in that culture before, going over to set up and lead on certain things. What was the kind of emotional settling in process like?
Hard, but I just put on a brave face because, by nature, and you're very much the same, we're thinking of the end goal. And I, failure wasn't an option. And I really wanted to make this work and achieve. So I had I had very good days and very bad days of being homesick and thinking, God, this isn't going to work because it's tough, Yes, there's the infrastructure and other lines of business are there, but to go out and set up a book of business from scratch in basically 6 different countries that speak 6 different languages is really challenging. But I think that you get out what you put in, and it was the long hours, it was the resilience of saying, I'm not going to let this drop until we get this done, basically. But no, I guess in the first sort of 6 months, I did feel quite fragile and nervous. But, if you put in the work and you're an open, good person and you're efficient, it will come to you. I think that's the problem. I had a discussion actually with a friend the other day, and I said, I do feel like sometimes people expect to achieve without putting the work in. I just think that in life now, you think that there's shortcuts to success, but there really isn't. You have to really, really work to achieve. There's no doubt about it.
You mentioned a really nice coping technique. I mean, it probably didn't feel nice, but hearing you say it was quite interesting to hear that reflection of escaping to the toilets and almost like re-energizing yourself, like reorganizing yourself at a networking event. What other kind of coping things did you come up with to help you through those harder times?
So before, I guess, and I don't know whether this is sort of the European way, but I do, because I feel like in London, not many people just say, you know what, I'm going to go for a walk. You just never really see people. I mean, when I'm walking around Bank now, everyone's going from A to B. They're so jam-packed with tasks and whatever that they're not actually taking time to reflect. I think reflection is essential because you have to reflect and think, what went badly? What do I need to do? I read in The Economist actually, literally yesterday, that they say that actually sadness and feeling down actually makes you more critical and makes you reevaluate what you should be doing. So weirdly, I think, going to the loos and having a cry, but also I used to go for walks around Paris. I used to sometimes walk home, which was, over an hour's walk, because I thought, because I don't really know anyone here and I don't have really anything here, my life isn't jam-packed full. So I'm actually just going to take an hour and walk and think. So it was more actually taking time. And I had the time because I wasn't so busy. Obviously, when you're in your home country, you're running to have a coffee with a friend and then you're working and then you go to your gym class. But I almost went and I had nothing other than work, didn't have any friends at the time. So I took a lot of time to reflect. And actually, now I've moved back to London, I still do that, even though I'm very busy. And I think it's helped me in my current role because I take time for reflection. I think that's absolutely key.
How do you do it now? Is it still like walking home or?
Walking. Walking is the best therapy because they say when a writer gets a writer's block, the writer should go for a drive or a walk because it increases the theta brainwave activity. And that's when you suddenly get new thoughts and realizations. So yeah, I carve out time to walk.
I've got one like that, but it's less. I burn less calories with mine. So I've worked out, like, I really struggle with switching off, and not necessarily switching off from work. In fact, this is just an observation I had this week, because I was like, I need to just have a break and switch off. But I thought about work the entire time, but I was thinking about it in a place where I couldn't do anything. So it was just thoughts that I could just sit with. But my place where I do it is a massage, right? I kind of try and book myself in every 2 months at least for, and this is what I've learned about myself, a 1 hour massage isn't enough, because just as like my brain starts to slow down and get into the good stuff, they're like, cool, all done, how was that? And I'm like, no, like, can I just have the room for another hour? So I do have to put myself in for like a double treatment, and then it's like it is my me time, but it does allow me to just stop, because I can't be on my phone, I can't interact with anybody. I'm using that time wisely, because otherwise I think I'm wasting my time. Like, I'm like, no, this is good, this is self-care, and the best ideas end up coming to me, and then I come out of it and everyone's like, oh, what, how was it? And I'm like, great, here's the to-do list now. That is what I was thinking about.
Person to leave the massage, everyone's sort of very calm. Sam's straight on the phone being like, right, I'm going to reevaluate the strategy of empower development.
It is like that, but it feels so refreshed doing it, rather than like, oh no, what am I doing? Have I thought about this enough? So I think that's wise. Maybe I do need to do a little bit more walking. It's probably a cheaper way of doing it, but I do like the massages. It does feel like a nice
I might try the massage.
So how about the social bit? Because like you say, you didn't have any friends there. So I think we often like focus on how we deal with the role, but again, we're people, we need that social environment. How did you go about making friends?
So weirdly, one of who's now my best friend, used to work in the industry. Well, she's back in the industry now, but at the time she said, she sat me, we were on a lunch. She worked at Willis as a PV broker, and I was working at Liberty at the time. And she said to me, Joanna, I'm about to resign. I'm just moving to Paris for personal reasons. And I thought, that's weird, because I was thinking in my head, because I'm about to hopefully get this job offer, I'm moving to Paris. So I said I had one friend basically, and we ended up living quite close to one another. But then I think in time I joined a netball group, all of the classic things that you do when you're an expat.
What are they? Because they're classic for you because you've done it. But for someone listening to this who hasn't done it, what are these things?
I think any kind of sport is great. I mean, I love my sport. So sport was a natural thing for me to get involved in. So netball, I joined the gym, and this was quite funny. So didn't speak a word of French, thought it would be a good idea to go to a Zumba class. And I was I didn't understand what he was saying, because he was going, à gauche, à droite. So I was like bumping into people. It was really like an Emily in Paris moment, because he was explaining the thing in French, and I was just having to quickly copy about sitting behind everyone else. So I met a few people doing that. And yeah, I mean, I guess weirdly in the office, I think I integrated in the end and made some good friends in the office. We used to all go down for drinks at the L'Avenue. And then I guess naturally, once you sort of have a few friends, then you meet friends through friends, and it sort of just goes from there, really. And I think that there aren't that many English people in Paris. So like everyone sort of knows one another type thing. So once you've got a few friends, you end up having a lot more.
And how did your French end up? Are you fluent?
Well, I've got my French lesson in 2 hours. I'm still doing French. I didn't work in French because political violence and terrorism was all underwritten and written. All the contracts were in English. So I didn't work in French. My biggest regret actually was the French, and we'll get onto it, because I can't look back and regret, because you know what? I got so much out of my experience there from a work perspective, personal. I couldn't have done everything. And I thought actually learning a language would be a lot easier than it has been. Learning French has been more challenging than my biochemistry degree at Durham. I think probably because I'm not a natural linguist, but I'm not going to give up. So I'm still doing my French. And I'd say I'm fluent in the sense that I can talk in a roundabout way, most topics, but it's like a muscle. You've got to keep working it. I live in Chelsea, and there's a French cinema just down the road, because there's a French lycée. So I went to the cinema last week. So I feel like if I moved back to France now with this level of French, then I would be absolutely fluent. But the problem is that I did GCSE, but I hadn't spoken or even looked at French for sort of 10 years before I moved out there. So yeah, that was a challenge.
So how did you end up coming back?
Well, I came back really because I felt like, so I went out alone in terms of from a product perspective to build the book of business. But then obviously we gained momentum. I ended up recruiting an underwriter who is now a very, very good friend, actually. She is German and she moved to Paris. I persuaded to move her life to Paris. And she's now marrying a guy and she lives in Paris. So that's all worked out really well for her. And then I recruited another underwriter. So it was kind of a natural, I wanted to get back to the UK for personal reasons. So it was sort of felt like a natural, got to the 3 years or over 3 years. It seemed like a natural time to come back. And there were 2 local underwriters then managing 2 of our main hubs. So it felt like a natural progression to then return back to the UK.
And what was the role looking like as you were moving back?
So the role at that time for Liberty was still head of continental Europe, war and terrorism. And that's where sort of very shortly after moving back to the UK, I then took my new job now, which is Underwriting Manager for AIG. So yeah, no, it all happened quite quickly, to be honest, moving back and then obviously moving jobs. But here I am and yeah, closed the Liberty chapter. I think it was 7 years in total. Yeah, I remember when I resigned, I wrote sort of a thank you note to say I couldn't thank this organisation enough. I've been promoted 5 times in 7 years, which is remarkable, really. And I've lived in 2 countries. I mean, you don't have many people with having had the opportunity to have that kind of experience in only 7 years. So yeah, closed that chapter and moved on to now.
And that's quite a hard move, I think, anyway, like leaving a company you've been in for so long, but when it's the company you joined as a graduate and then kind of left as a sort of senior, I feel like the emotive tie would have been quite challenging there. So how was that kind of going into a new company?
Really hard. And actually, I said to a colleague literally on Wednesday, I said it actually moving companies was a lot harder than I thought, a lot harder. Actually, when I look back at it now, I'm thinking actually, and I don't know, because you always feel like what you're doing now is the hardest, but I actually think when I compare it, I think moving companies was harder than moving abroad and taking that challenge in Paris, because I think that particularly that first move, I think if I moved on again, it would be fine, but it's that first job outside of your first job, if that makes sense, because you join a company as a graduate and you've got no experience in the workplace other than probably work experience, but that shapes you from a cultural perspective, from a work perspective, and each company is different. So I think that when you then leave that, you think, God, this is almost more of a culture shock than moving abroad in some ways. Obviously there are some similarities, but I think that as you say, it was difficult leaving a company where I had had such a positive experience. But at the time, I look back now and I'm so thankful I did take the jump to where I am now, because I've also in the last 18 months learned more than I learned in the 7 years at the start of my career. So it's been an amazing transition to go into what I'm doing now. But yeah, no, it was really difficult to leave. But yeah, I think that it was a natural course. I think that when you are ambitious, and I think it is good to get a different company feel. I do believe that, okay, yes, some people stay at one company for all of their career, but it's quite unheard of. I think that if you are young and ambitious, I think you've got to make a move to another company, because I think it shapes your experience. I think the first 10 years are very important. I think it's good to move. I'm not saying move around, but I think when you've done that 7-year stint or whatever, I think it is good to get different experience, 100%.
And you, as an individual, are quite, you said yourself, you kind of like to do things fast and be quite ambitious with your goals. How do you sort of manage this? Can you talk us through what an average week might look like in terms of your waking hours, working hours, and your kind of balance that you aspire for?
So yeah, I mean, I get up at 5:30, which weirdly, when I was working on the continent, it was late nights and later mornings, I guess. But now I get up at 5:30 if I'm going to the office. So I usually do 3 days a week in the office. I will be in the office just after 7. But are
you the only one there at that time, or do you find there's a group of people?
I mean, Chris Rash, our CEO, I don't know what time he gets in, but he's always there when I'm there. Lots of my team are in at 7:30. And then, 7:30. And then I guess we leave at 6:30. But then often I'll come home and I'll have to do a bit more at home. But I'm a perfectionist. It's good, but I have to keep reminding myself, you can't underwrite every single submission and you can't do everything. That is something I'm trying to get better at, because you don't want to go into burnout. You don't want to end up working so much that you resent your job. But I like to make the most of my days. It's a bit like the Paris scenario. I was out sort of networking during the day, but then I guess I have to do all of the sort of the legwork in the evening. And I guess now I just try and get the most out of every day, and there's just not enough hours in the day. So I end up having to work a bit outside sort of the normal working hours. But no, I'm getting better at saying no to things and basically saying, you know what, I'm not going to say yes to every opportunity. I'm going to be really economical with my time, because I think when you are trying to do everything and achieve everything, you actually end up wasting a lot of time, because not every opportunity is worth your time. That's something I've got a lot better at recently.
How do you distinguish what is and what isn't worth it?
I guess it's not just talking about underwriting submissions. That's one thing, but I'm thinking, if someone asked me to do something like a podcast on a Friday or is it going to a conference, or is it doing this? Like, what is this going to achieve? What is the outcome of this? And is it going to advance? And I'm not one of those people that is always looking for doing things just from a selfish advancement. If it's helping someone, I'm not saying that it's got to always be something that works out well for yourself, but it's more like, is this a good use of time? What am I going to get out of it? Is someone else getting something out of it that's beneficial? Making sure that I'm economical. One of the grads asked me to help him with his law coursework, and I think you'll remember that I think we all got told off for being silly.
Yeah, you're not allowed to do that.
And I know he asked me some questions. I wasn't helping him, and I just was giving him some pointers, and I said that is a good use of time, I think, because he said to me, I really appreciate you sitting down and helping me for that half an hour. That's a good use of time. That's not something that I've necessarily benefited from, but I think it's about making sure you're not doing things just for the sake of it, basically.
Mm-hmm. So I have a bit of a rule that we look at in courses where people are looking at trying to work out, and mine is kind of you're identifying whether it's outside your comfort zone. Okay, so if it's going to push you in terms of confidence, then that's going to be an advantage. If it's outside your competence, okay, so just in terms of actually you haven't done it before, or you're going to get some new experiences from it, but worthwhile. And then connections, like, are you going to kind of benefit from building some connections out of those? And ideally, if you've got all three, brilliant, like that's a no-brainer, say yes. Mm-hmm. Or if you've got two, say yes. And then if it's just one, then just think about it and make sure you're not maybe always the one volunteering and looking around the room and just see if there's anyone else who could or should be maybe volunteering as well.
I'd quite like to go on that course.
Women with presence. There we go. You can come along. Yeah, because we do find, I don't think this is probably the type of work you're talking about, but women are twice as likely as men to volunteer for what we call non-promotion work. So the stuff that keeps you busy and fills your diary, but isn't really going to help you achieve what your objectives are. Things like, writing up the minutes or booking the rooms and those things that kind of somebody has to do, but usually no one volunteers to do. But the scary bit of research on this I always find shocking is that managers are also more likely to ask women to do it in the room. And that doesn't change whether the manager is a male or a female. So as women, we are more likely to also pick out the women and say, oh, do you mind writing this up?
Yeah.
When there might be lots of other people in the room who quite equally can do it.
That's interesting, but not surprising, actually.
Yeah. It's a shame, isn't it? I think we're all looking for people who will say yes, because all of us want an easy conversation. So we're encouraging that. We're not helping necessarily. So awareness often is all we need.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about how you fit the rest of your stuff in? So that's how you're kind of, you're cramming all this work in. You've mentioned you're good at kind of making sure you exercise and have those kind of things in as well. How do you kind of prioritize your personal time?
Well, I try and on weekends really have weekends just and holidays now, not doing any work, basically. I think that's really important to actually take time off when you say you're going to take time off. And I think that's been really good in my current role. I think that the team and culture is very much like work hard when you're working, but, you know, take time off when you say you're going to take time off. And I think that the weekends are really important. I'd say in the week, I need to get better at having a bit more time outside of work. But I guess because I'm really having a nice weekend, I like to go into the weekend feeling like everything's organized. So yeah, I don't spend too much time in the week doing enough for myself, I think. I mean, I exercise and whatever, but I don't think anyone has lots of time to themselves. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, do you have time for yourself during the week?
I do have some boundaries in place for me. I keep, but it's quite funny whenever you talk to different people, we've all got a different expectation of balance. So from my perspective, I close my laptop most days at 5:00, but I have my phone in my hand permanently from that point on. So I'm like, no, I'm done, but I will, you know, and because my work comes from so many different platforms, you know, like I'm making, this morning I was like posting a TikTok at 6 a.m. Right now, would you call that work or not? That in my head, I'm like, well, it's TikTok, but the reality is it is work. So it is kind of, for me, it's picking bits and pieces. But of course, where I've got children, my evenings are different. Before I had kids, it was very different. I'd often look at, you know, if there's a piece of work I wanted to get done, I would absolutely just work till it was done. Whereas now I just can't, because they will be pulling at me like, come on, can we do this? And so on. So I can't concentrate anyway. So I have to put those time frames in. But it depends. I mean, we go through busy periods. When we were making our CII platform, me and Grace were working any window we could. I'd be looking at an Easter weekend like, yes, look, I've got an extra 4 days there without any meetings where I can get all this work done. But I'm trying not to do that, just to allow myself that on those days, of course, I know I'm going to be on LinkedIn and I'm going to be on TikTok, and I don't have to kick myself for it, because I'm also knowing that I'm shutting my laptop down at 5:00. Having said that, you know, that sounds really good, but I'm also out at least probably twice a week. So I'm like, yes, my laptop's closed, but what about those evenings where I don't see the kids and I don't put them to bed, you know, because that's happening probably on average twice a week as well. So yeah, I think for me, I try and have some like almost like alarm things in my diary. Like if I've got 3 evenings in 1 week, I feel like that's too much. And I'll look at them and be like, can I decline any of these?
Yeah.
And the answer might be no, but it's like, be conscious about it. The other thing I do now, which is just my favorite hobby, other than my massages, is I stay in London once every other week, usually. So if I've got an evening in London and then I'm in London the next day, I'll use that as my opportunity to stay overnight. And I don't live far out. I'm in Bromley. It's not too far to go. But the key thing for me is if I'm at home, I get woken up by the kids. And then it's like Peppa Pig's on the TV, people are climbing all over you, you've got 3 people to get dressed, there's breakfast, there's lunch to pack. By the time I've started my day, I'm already like ready for a cup of tea and a sit down. Whereas if I wake up in a hotel, I'm like, wow, I've now got 3 hours uninterrupted to do what I want. And that might be that I'm going to do all of my emails and my LinkedIn messages, because I kind of tackle those every few days. I can't manage them every day now. I'll chunk them up. Yeah. Or it might be that I'm going to make a load of TikToks, or it might be that I'm not going to do anything and I'm not going to feel guilty about that. But I've just got that little window to kind of put in. We're all different. I know a lot of you and I, the way we work ends up being quite similar. We've traded notes enough over this to know that that's like what we hear of each other probably sounds kind of reasonable. But I know a lot of people listening to this will think that that's absolutely not what they want to do. And they'd be horrified to hear you're in the office at 7:30, you know, but these are choices that we all can look at and work out and prioritize how we want to do things for ourselves. I don't think there's a right answer.
Exactly. And I think you have to mold it to your personality and what fits for you. You know, I would rather be in the office at 7:30 or up at 5:30, because I need that time to make sure there's no typos in my emails, you know, because I have a tendency, probably the same as you, to be at 100 miles an hour. I need to take time to make sure that I'm giving everything enough time and not rushing, because I'm always on to the next thing. So I've got to carve out time, and I know I've got to do that in order to achieve. So it's just, and that's what makes me happy. So, you know, it's all about strategies that you know work for you.
Yeah. And I think just not feeling guilty with what works for you. You know, it is okay, as long as you're conscious. I think as long as you feel like you have some choice and awareness of what you're doing, then it is okay to prioritize things the way you want to.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, so let's look ahead. right? So, I mean, you say you're coming like 10 years in. 10 years is obviously far too long, but your kind of short, medium term goals, like what are you setting for yourself to push yourself for?
Well, I'd say that the role that I've taken now, and I'm 18 months in, has been a real challenge. I mean, I'm now working in an area of the business. So what I did at Liberty obviously was growing PV and terrorism in Europe, basically, I'd say was the highlight of my time at Liberty, taking out all of the, the earlier years of training. Now I've come into AIG Talbot technically. So AIG bought Talbot in 2018, and they named Talbot the Centre of Excellence, basically, for political violence and terrorism. So I think we've got a team of about 20 underwriters at Talbot, and Edward Atquin, my manager, hired me in basically to develop terrorism and political violence across AIG. And with that, basically, there's been a huge focus on sort of multinational programs, working with captives and issuing admitted paper. Now, that's something that I've never, ever done before. They had to take a role and learn very quickly on the job what to do and all of the detail of it. So that's been a massive challenge. And for the first time in my life, I'm very comfortable. There's so much to do and so much to learn, and I'm in an amazing environment for that I feel like there's a lot more to do where I am at the moment, which is a nice feeling to know that you're in a really good environment that's challenging you every day, and it's got that rigor that I really wanted, that I was looking for basically when I left Liberty. So I think for the medium to short term that there's a lot of experience to be had where I am, which is a nice feeling for someone that suffers from not feeling like they're getting a challenge. So it was definitely the right decision. And I think for now, I'm just going to ride the wave here. And
for people listening to this that maybe inspired by your 5 promotions in 7 years. It's quite a statement. I love that. We have to kind of like tagline you.
5 promotions in 7 years and living in 2 countries. God, Liberty are going to be having all the grads from.
Yeah, I think it's worth making a statement of that's not the expectation. It's not the benchmark.
It's not the norm.
But it is inspirational. So what advice would you give for people listening in terms of taking their own careers forwards? We always end with one sort of top tip.
Yeah.
So what's kind of your recommendation?
Kind of, as I said earlier at the beginning, I think that, when people look from the outside and think 5 promotions in 7 years, living abroad, I said earlier about hard work and commitment. And I think, not everyone wants to be promoted 5 times in 7 years. Actually being promoted once is enough. So I think I would figure out what you really want, what you want from your career, and set aside a plan of how to get there. I think that if the expectation is quick progression, then you have to put the work in, you have to sit down and do your ACII in 18 months, or maybe you don't have to, but you've got to really push yourself. I was on a mentoring scheme in Paris. And my mentor was she's the CFO of Allianz Mediterranean region. And she said to me, basically, we spoke about progression and what the future and, what you had to do to achieve. And she said to me that actually, in order to be at the very top, you almost have to have an action plan every year. Where am I going? What am I doing? Am I fulfilling myself? Setting aside actually goals to achieve each year. And I think that's important. I think that if progression is something that is important to you, I think you've got to really think about putting in the hours, because things don't just happen. You really have to work for them.
And ask, I think, is the other observation, I think, from listening to you, right? Like, you wouldn't have got that Paris role if you didn't ask.
No, exactly. Ask, put yourself out there, because you'd be surprised. And not enough people they don't want to ask. And actually, that was one word of advice when my father dropped me off at the Eurostar, because he's obviously been in the industry. And he said, never be afraid to ask someone, ask brokers, do they have business? People are quite proud now, I think. And it's actually good to just be yourself and just say, you know what, I am inexperienced, I am young, but would you give me the opportunity? And if the answer's no, then, I think in the future you'd be earmarked for it, because you put yourself out there. I would say that things don't just happen to you. I really, really can't stress that enough. Things don't just get handed to you on a plate. You have to work for them, and you have to ask. You have to be open to experiencing and taking opportunities that you probably didn't think that. I mean, if someone said to me 2 years before I moved to Paris, you're going to move to Paris for 3.5 years. I would say, you crazy. I struggled with my French GCSE, and, you know, I don't have any affiliation to Europe. So I think it's about being open as well, open and flexible to opportunities that arise. Because I think we all have a set plan and we have an idea of where you think you're going to be and what you're going to achieve. Well, what I would say is that actually there's got to be some flexibility in that, because sometimes actually an opportunity arises and it's not part of your plan that you've had since you were 16. But you think actually that could work. So it's about not being too narrow-minded in what you think that you should be doing. So have your goals, think about what's important to you, but also be flexible and be open to everything that's around you.
Brilliant. I love that. So it's like work out what the destination is, but being open to different routes to get there.
Because I listened to a podcast the other day about serendipity, and it was about basically how to create your own luck. I loved it. You would love it, Sam. It's very you. So there's 2 scenarios. The first scenario, a man walks down the street and he sees a £5 note. And the first man just picks it up and walks on because he's late for his meeting. And he's really stressed and busy, and he's on to the next thing. And it really kind of circles back to my point about walking and not just going from A to B quickly. So that's scenario 1. The second man who walks past picks up the £5 note, which, by the way, is left on the road outside of a cafe. And then he thinks, God, that is amazing that I've just picked up £5. You know, I'm going to go into the cafe and buy myself a coffee and just sit down for a second and enjoy this moment that's just fallen onto my lap, basically. So he sits into the cafe. He gets chatting to someone in the cafe who's basically setting up a business. And anyway, the guys end up working together in the future. And that's just like 2 scenarios, basically, which I think is so important. I think, you know, actually be open to your surroundings, because that's how, if you're an open person and you're willing and you're giving and you're open to discussion and you're open to different scenarios, I think that things happen to you. If you're narrow-minded on A to B and you're on your kind of railroad, things don't happen. I think you've got to just pause and be openness, I'd say.
Steve Jobs used to say, you can only connect the dots looking back. It's one of my favorite quotes. And I think quite often when people say to me things like, well, which networking should I go to meet the people that will do this for me? And I'm like, you can't plot the dots like that. You need dots everywhere. And some of them might come to something and some of them won't. And that's okay. Like, you just need to just be genuinely doing things because you think you're doing the right thing. And if you're doing enough things, the right things will happen.
Exactly. Oh, I like that. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, go for it. Cool. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been lovely to talk to you. Weird to talk to you on Zoom. I'll have to do it in person again soon. But lovely to kind of reminisce over some of this and hear some of it for the first time.
I know. God, I wish I could do it all again.
Do you?
No. Well, let's schedule a podcast in 7 years' time and see number of promotions and where, if I've moved abroad again.
Yeah, I think if you hit that twice, I'll buy you lunch.
That makes a change.
Excellent. We'll speak to you later on.
Bye, Sam.
Bye.